For those that don't know me, my name is Jason Madden. I am the program advisor for IHN Online and self-paced programs. And today we're here for another Con Ed webinar, Mineral Imbalances and Iron-Deficiency Anemia, which we're going to learn a little bit about the impact of minerals on iron-deficiency anemia and how this affects the body's energy production. Talk about, I'd say maybe an overlooked mineral in copper. So it should be a very interesting topic, and stick around to the end because there is a giveaway at the end, and we'll also have time for some questions at the end. Yeah, I'd like to introduce today's speaker. Lisa Pitel-Killah is a certified functional diagnostic nutrition practitioner and board certified holistic health practitioner with extensive expertise in mineral analysis. Lisa is the founder of Vicon Customs, specializing in custom supplementation based on HTMA science. And she has helped tens of thousands address the root causes of their health issues through a holistic approach focused on mineral balance. And we're fortunate that she's here to share some of that wisdom with us here tonight. So without any further ado, I'll toss it over to you, Lisa.
Thank you so much, Jason. All right, we're going to get started right away, and hopefully you all enjoy the presentation. All right, so today we're going to be talking about, of course, as Jason mentioned, are mineral deficiencies at the root cause of iron deficiency anemia. And so iron deficiency, we see it in a lot of clients nowadays, but there is definitely a mineral that can be overlooked from that perspective. So I want to dig into that mineral today. I want to share as much as I can, and just hoping that you'll walk away with this presentation with a new kind of outlook at what could potentially be causing some of the problems with clients. So let's get started. So I always like to give a little bit of a background. And for those of you who are new, many of you are going to know this already, but maybe some of you don't. So HTMA, what is that? It actually stands for hair tissue mineral analysis. And so a hair sample is used to evaluate its mineral content. It literally gives us a window into the cell's activity, into its mineral activity, so that we can treat the foundation of health of that individual. Analyzing hair tissue can sometimes bring to light toxicities and other issues within the body, sometimes months or even years before they'll ever be detected by blood serum testing, because it's a snapshot. It shows us an average of the mineral system's activity over about a 3 to 4 month period, depending on the length of the sample that is submitted. So let's take a look at, this is a trace elements test. Again, many of you may be very familiar with this test, but this test is showing us not this specific graph. This is just one graph on the test. It tests for 37 different elements, including our vital minerals, which you'll see in front of you here, some additional elements, heavy metals. It also gives us our significant ratios, our additional ratios, and then some research ratios as well. So when analyzing any one mineral, we have to look at the big picture. And I'm going to talk about that today too, because that really is one of the most important factors. It truly does make this test one of the toughest to interpret. But once you understand the differences between external and extracellular, and intracellular minerals, it makes a lot more sense when you're looking at the test as to what you're seeing in the actual individual. And that includes what we call the big four minerals. So the big four minerals being calcium, magnesium, sodium, and potassium. So these all make a major impact on health because they make up the majority of the significant ratios. So let's talk a little bit about those. So there really are 7 main ratios. These ratios were discovered back in the 1970s by Dr. Eck and Dr. Watts. All of these ratios identify systems of the body and how they're working at a deep cellular level. Identifying imbalances, again, as I mentioned earlier, can bring to light issues, conditions, and things that may be proactively supported prior to blood work showing there's actually a problem. Blood always wants to be in homeostasis. So it will pull or deposit minerals out or into the tissues based on its own levels, and that's why it can stay homeostatic for so long. Therefore, HTMA can be used as a preventative measure to make sure the body is functioning optimally. The balance of significant ratios may actually be more important than the individual minerals levels themselves. And so I will kind of add a caveat to that is when we look at the significant ratios, when we have mineral balancing in process, the ratios will tend to come back into balance first, and then the mineral levels will follow. But they're both very important because the further a mineral level is from its optimal level, the more energy the body will be losing. So there really is an interesting ratio versus mineral level comparison for us to make. And I'm going to dig a little more into that on the next slide. So again, some of you may have seen these before. When we look at the calcium to phosphorus ratio, that's what we call the metabolic ratio or the oxidation ratio. And so this really tells us if the body is tapping into parasympathetic, so rest and digest, or sympathetic, fight or flight. And so the more elevated this ratio is, the more the body is trying to slow down and tap into that rest and digest deep into some healing space sometimes. When we're really gearing the body back up, or when there's a lot of stress and the stress is just happening and it's very acute, then that's when the calcium to phosphorus ratio may be very low and the body is triggering fight or flight. Sodium to potassium is a really important ratio, and I'll tell you why. Because it represents vitality. It also tells us a lot about stress. So let's talk about vitality first. The vitality ratio really gives us an insight into the person. Sometimes the sodium to potassium ratio, such as this one, for example, which actually is quite balanced, can show us stress resiliency. And that's great. This particular individual, who was one of my clients years ago, was feeling fantastic. So that 2.4 ideal sodium to potassium ratio was representative of stress resiliency. Now, let's say that the person wasn't feeling great and maybe some of the other ratios were a little less balanced. Then this could actually be a resilient stage of stress as the person moves into exhaustion. So when we look at the levels of stress, a really high sodium to potassium means that we have an acute alarm stage of stress. Again, that optimal or ideal level can mean either we have stress resiliency, which is a celebration, or we have a body resisting stress that is on the decline. And the decline being an inverted sodium to potassium, where now we're dealing with chronic or an exhaustive stage of stress. This is important and one of the most important ratios, I think, because of the fact that sometimes we have people who are in mental sympathetic dominance, but the body is falling behind. And, we all have had those clients, or, we may even be this way ourselves, where we're kind of pushing forward really headstrong and not necessarily listening to what our body is trying to tell us. And this is when the body starts to go into burnout, deficiencies start to happen, systems start to decline in their optimal functioning, but we're still mentally headstrong pushing forward. And we can see that in the sodium to potassium ratio. And sometimes people are quite surprised at the results of their sodium to potassium ratio when it comes back on a test. And ultimately, the body's telling us a different story, right? The thyroid ratio is the next one, calcium to potassium. So the lower this ratio is, the more overactive the thyroid expression will be. The higher it is, the more sluggish. And again, we're not here to diagnose. This is a screening tool, but blood labs are always advantageous when we're looking at thyroid. Hormone ratio, zinc to copper. Zinc is heavily intertwined with testosterone for men, progesterone for women, and copper with estrogen. So we tend to see this ratio a little trending high in men in most cases. It's also, when it's really high or really low, could be indicative of copper issues. The hormone ratio, the adrenal ratio, sodium to magnesium at 5.14. This one here is just above optimal, but what we want to see is we want to see this ratio really close to optimal, because healthy adrenal function means we do have stress resiliency. We have energy. So the lower this ratio gets, the less energy the body is going to be able to have. Now, let's go back to how I said the ratios do mean just as much or maybe a little bit more than the levels. Now, if you had a sodium to magnesium ratio that was really high in a fast oxidizer, would you have more energy? Potentially, depending on how high that sodium to magnesium ratio actually was. If the sodium to magnesium ratio was a little bit elevated, maybe not significantly elevated, but the sodium was at, say, 100 and the potassium was at 40, would that still mean that this person was stress resilient, right? That our adrenals are functioning well? We're going to have less energy the further away from our mineral levels are to their optimal levels. So if the sodium should be 24 and it's at 100 and the potassium should be 10 and it's at 40, we're going to have energy loss in the body. So slowing that down and really bringing that ratio closer to optimal is going to be really important. Calcium to magnesium, 8.14. This is our blood sugar ratio. So the higher this is, the more tendency someone has for hypoglycemic reactions, and lower would be hyperglycemic. Again, we've got blood sugar imbalances on both sides, and we really need to make sure that the calcium and magnesium are in check to be able to ensure proper insulin release and also glucose regulation. The infection ratio, iron to copper, here is almost optimal. That really just tells us a little bit about virus, bacteria, potential issues in the body. Really, this ratio you need to take with a bit of a grain of salt because of the fact that unless it's really high or really low, a lot of people don't put heavy weight on this. What you can do, and what I suggest doing, is making sure that you're correlating this with symptoms, right? Everything about HTMA comes back to the symptomology of the individual because that tells you a huge story and allows you to really dig in to what some of those root causes might be. So when we talk about the oxidation rate as well, there's different subtypes that are identified. So I don't want to make this complicated. What we're going to say is that our calcium to phosphorus ratio, which is that very first ratio, right, our oxidation ratio, if it's high, so again, in that parasympathetic dominance, there's different comparisons and pairs that go with that. So we could have someone who's in rest and digest and with sluggish adrenals, sluggish thyroid, so a lot of underactivity. We could have a mix of the two. Or we could have overactivity and still be kind of tapping into that parasympathetic dominance, right? Same goes with fast oxidation. So when the calcium to phosphorus is low, we can have different functioning within the adrenals and the thyroid on both sides of those levels. Now, the interesting part is there's a couple of different ways to look at this particular teeter-totter. And so really here what we're doing is we're putting the extremes on the outside. And the outside being if a fast one has overactivities in the adrenal and thyroid, that's really a pattern that can be volatile. On the other side of things, a slow one with kind of underactivity in the adrenals and thyroid can be just as volatile but very underactive. So they really do kind of have a balance on that teeter-totter, one being really heavy, which is the slow oxidation, and one being kind of raised up, which is the fast oxidation. So looking further just at identifying what the fast and slow oxidation mean, I thought it was necessary to bring just another slide into the picture depicting what could be that volatile state. So fast oxidation, this is fast 1 oxidation, so the outside of that teeter-totter. The calcium to phosphorus is slightly low at 2.06, right? We see it's below optimal. We've got a calcium to potassium that's at 0.18, so very low. So now we have hyperactive thyroid or an overactive thyroid expression. Sodium to magnesium at 46.41. Again, that's where the adrenals are showing overactivity. We're going to have a higher production of aldosterone in the body. We're going to have this particular individual is going to have a higher attraction for levels of meat and fat in the diet, especially heavier, fattier meats, because it calms them down. It calms their body is really a fast burning fire. And when that happens, we need more of the oils and the heavier meats and organ meats even to kind of calm down the flames a little bit. And so they have a tendency to be warm, which would make sense. They have an excess retention of sodium and potassium, and these are the types of individuals that are at risk for severe calcium and magnesium deficiency. Now, flip the coin to slow oxidation. Now we're at the other end of that teeter-totter, right? In that underactive state where the teeter-totter's on the ground. Calcium to phosphorus here at 3.94, so we are in that rest and digest phase. We have a lower production of aldosterone, poor retention of sodium and potassium. Calcium begins to build up in the tissues, which really kind of weighs us down, right? Calcium causes a lot of oxidative stress, but it's a very sedative, heavy mineral. It slows everything down, including the metabolism, including the bowels. And we could have magnesium that's bio-unavailable. So it's in a loss pattern and ultimately in a deficient state. So in my opinion, and one of the reasons I chose to specialize in this particular test a long time ago was that minerals really are the building blocks of our health. And I like to call it the foundation of our house, right? If we have a foundation that's cracked, that has holes, leaks, then we're not going to have a solid foundation for that house to sit on. And it's the same for ourselves. If we don't have a solid health foundation with proper mineral levels, we're going to be sequestering heavy metals, we're going to be succumbing to, lowered immunity and many, many other problems. Minerals are needed for millions of enzymes as cofactors, facilitators, inhibitors, and actually as part of the enzymes themselves. Their bioavailability and usability both have a great deal to do with the actual health of the human body. They're the underbelly of what lies above. And without mineral balance, a cascade of metabolic chaos may ensue. And for those of you who are FDNs, that came, of course, from Reed Davis. So let's talk about some principles of minerals. So Eck states, every mineral has an effect on every other mineral, which is very true. There's always going to be synergistic and antagonistic effects between minerals, even vitamins, heavy metals, of course. And so we really have to consider these relationships. And these relationships go even deeper to equate to the level of supplementation that people decide upon as well. He said that most people around the world are mineral deficient. And I think with today's day and age and farming and soil depletion and things like that, that's not necessarily not true. Symptoms of mineral deficiency are often identical to symptoms of mineral excess. And we'll talk about that today with copper. Minerals can substitute or displace one another, right? Think about copper and zinc. Balance is expressed in ratios, as we saw, mathematically. Main minerals need to be maintained and supported a certain balance, or disease or conditions can result. And really, when it comes down to it, the bioavailability and usability of a mineral is paramount. And so I think about a perfect example here when we talk about copper, right? Vitamin A supports the usability and bioavailability of copper. And another one is P5P, form of vitamin B6, helps the usability of zinc, right? So there's a lot of vitamins that can support the bioavailability and usability of minerals as well. So let's dig down the road of copper toxicity. Some people like to call this copper dysregulation. Copper overload is another one. We're just going to call it toxicity for simplicity, and I'm going to walk you through some of the basics. So copper is an essential micronutrient. It's good for vital health. It supports energy production. If we have a low copper level, usually it's seen in fast oxidizers, not always, but sometimes. This usually is an absolute copper deficiency. So they need support with copper foods, with supplementation. And again, when we look at traditional fast 1 oxidizers, these are the folks that are craving more of those heavier meats, right? The organ meats, and that can handle them because their digestion is heightened. When we have a low copper level in slow oxidizers, this can mean something completely different. And so a low copper level for me is identified when a hair level is less than 2 mg%. It's really insignificant to say we have, low copper if this particular individual is in slow oxidation. In most slow oxidizers, a low copper level means bio-unavailable and potentially excess hidden copper, right? So we really have to go through and do our checks and balances and correlate with symptoms. I'm going to talk about what those are today too. If this is the case, then reducing the potential exposure to copper is essential, right? So whether it's birth control, copper IUD, swimming every day in a pool, the individual would need adrenal support as well to help stimulate the body's production of ceruloplasmin in the liver to bind and transport that copper out of the body. And we're going to talk today too about how copper builds up step by step so that you can understand how this happens and then how it affects iron. So what is copper toxicity? At the end of the day, it comes down to it's a buildup of stored bio-unavailable copper that when at excess levels can cause physical and mental issues. It's copper that's unbound and unusable by the body and therefore creates a simultaneous toxicity deficiency situation. Copper toxicity is actually the primary cause of copper deficiency and I will say a main driver of iron-deficiency anemia. Copper will accumulate in the body's tissues as well as the liver and the brain, where it can be responsible for severe mental health issues such as ADD, ADHD, pseudobipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and OCD. Copper can remain in cells and tissues, including the brain and the liver, which are the main two storage sites when tissue concentrations get high, for decades. And so let's talk about some causes. And we hear all the time about the epidemic of copper, right? And I really do think that some of this comes back around to birth control, right? Coming into the market, 60s, 70s, right? We see a lot of older individuals that are in their 80s, women, and even some of them in their later 70s, and they're still fast oxidizers. Whereas a lot of women who are kind of in all the way from 20s all the way up to say, even early 70s who are, having trouble getting out of slow oxidation, but they're the ones that took birth control for, 10 or 20 or even 30 years. Estrogen HRT can do the same thing. So hormone replacement therapy, right? So again, as the body has healthy zinc stores, as it has healthy adrenal function, we feel better, but how many people start off on estrogen HRT, including progesterone in there too, and then they feel great for, a month or 2 months, and then all of a sudden they don't feel so great anymore. And it's because we never know exactly what's, how much copper the body actually needs. That's a tough one. And when it starts to build, then we have this kind of turn from an energy perspective in the body. Chronic stress is another one. Right? So when we think about the stress that even people have been under in the past, 4 or 5 years, this is a huge burden on the body and everything starts to slow down. And as soon as the adrenals are affected, that's when ceruloplasmin gets affected as well. Coming back around even to copper drinkware, like Moscow mules or even, at different restaurants and things like that. I saw those coming out, 5-10 years ago. People who, again, are vegetarian, have vegan diets, this is going to be another one. Copper sulfate, which is an approved organic fertilizer. Even copper cookware. I actually had a client a few weeks back who had an elevated copper on a test, and they were cooking with copper cookware. So we found the source, and they removed it right away because they were like, oh my gosh, we had no idea that this was something that could contribute to something that would be eventually building in our body and causing imbalances. So let's talk about how copper builds up, because this is important to understand. So first off, we have an ongoing exposure of some kind, right? Could be direct copper exposure, like I just said with the copper cookware, right? Could be direct copper exposure, or it could be exposure to synthetic estrogens as well. Initially, what happens is the body compensates. Again, as long as there's healthy adrenal function, healthy bile function, and some good, healthy zinc stores. Copper enters the body, and if you have ever heard Dr. Malter speak about copper, you know that he has termed it an excitotoxin. And that just means that it's constantly stimulating the body, right? Copper is a great electrical conductor. And I really didn't know the depth of that until I started treating dogs. And when you have a dog, I have one specific case where the copper in a dog was at 51. And when you start treating a dog with copper toxicity, when you walk up to the dog and you go to put your hand on their back to pet them, their skin jolts because they feel that electricity coming as your energy comes closer to them, right? So that's the first time I really realized the impact that copper could have on our system, on our central nervous system. And what happens when copper starts to build in the body, now we have adrenal glands that are being constantly stimulated. They'll keep up in the beginning, but usually they're going to weaken, right? It may take some time. It may happen right away. It depends on the strength of the adrenals of that person. And that is going to result in a lower production of ceruloplasmin. So we're going to have less copper that's traveling around because the taxi cabs are in the garage and they're not coming out, right? Zinc starts to decline as copper starts to build because it has an antagonistic effect on zinc, right? Copper and zinc are antagonists. So as soon as we have too much copper, it's going to start affecting the absorption of zinc. Stress rises. The first thing that happens when we're under stress is sodium increases at the expense of potassium. And this causes the body to burn more magnesium. And magnesium deficiency, I always talk about calcium being kind of in a gated area, right? Magnesium are the guards outside. As soon as magnesium deficiency kind of comes in, it means the guards are missing, the gates kind of blow open, and calcium is allowed to run rampant in the body, but in the wrong place, right? So we really need to get magnesium back into the picture in order to have calcium under control and in the bones and the teeth where it actually should be. So now we have elevated tissue calcium. What happens then? Well, we know that the calcium to potassium ratio tells us how the thyroid's functioning, so it starts to slow down. And then iron deficiency may arise as copper blocks the effects of iron in the mitochondria. Right, so copper starts to build, and all of a sudden now we have a negative effect on iron. And that's not the only way that iron's affected here. When copper starts to elevate in tissue concentrations, first off, the liver concentrations increase first. There's many articles about this, followed by buildup in the brain, which can cause neurotransmitter imbalances as well as fatigue, low energy, depression, anxiety, and all the other conditions that I mentioned earlier. The adrenals tend to burn out to that copper overstimulation. Serotonin is oxidized. We have mood changes then. Person gets emotional numbness. Also, calcium can really buffer our emotions and cause social withdrawal, and apathy may actually result. So this may bring about a distortion of thoughts, reality that really isn't what reality really is. It may affect relationships. The other thing that you'll see in copper toxic individuals is histamine breakdown is blocked. So a lot of them have hives and rashes when copper's been around for a while. I actually have a friend like that right now. And that is a common instance, especially when we have skin conditions. So copper increase is also tightly tied into things like psoriasis, eczema, and of course hives and rashes, as I mentioned. So let's talk a little bit about ceruloplasmin. I'm going to pull an excerpt from an article. This is a very important glycoprotein. It is the primary copper transporter. About 90 to 95% of copper is transported via CP. It's produced in the liver. The adrenals, as we mentioned earlier, aid in its production. If they're weak and constantly being stimulated by copper, then CP production is going to be incrementally decreased. And this is going to affect copper transport, which then affects iron. Copper leaves the body via bile. And so if the bile is thickened due to excess estrogen, remember, estrogen and copper are succinctly related. This process too will decrease and cause copper to build up even further. So it's a vicious cycle once copper starts building. So the biochemistry of ceruloplasmin, you can read about this. Really what I wanted to bring to the table is that the liver is really the crucial organ in copper homeostasis, right? And we need to have ceruloplasmin there in order to transport it. Now, we also have to think about the transport of ionic copper, which is albumin. Right? So even if you have someone with aceruloplasminemia, you may be able to have strong enough albumin to help the process. But ultimately, at the end of the day, what this means is that the liver, if that's the first place that copper builds and causes congestion, the homeostasis kind of goes off the rails right away. And so the reaction to copper toxicity, if we can have long-term toxicity, severe toxicity, sluggish adrenals, sluggish thyroid that's where slow oxidation comes in, right? We talked about that process of the copper elevating, causing stress, the sodium going up, the potassium going down, the magnesium decreasing, and all of a sudden we have tissue calcification, and that really does slow the body down. Excess copper in the brain produces a driven feeling. So it's almost like a feeling where fast forward is like an addiction to these particular people. Sometimes they can't sleep, right? We'll talk about some of the symptoms in a minute. And they'll drive themselves and crash into exhaustion just because they're so mentally driven by this copper that's stimulating their brain. Copper causes potassium to reduce. So this is why, again, copper can sort of be the driver of panic attacks and severe anxiety. But it's really because the potassium level is so low. And as soon as potassium hits less than 4 mg%, this is where mental sympathetic dominant kind of comes in. These are the people that are driving their minds forward, but their bodies aren't responding anymore because they're just exhausted, right? And so mind races due to excess copper in the brain, but the body's exhausted. So this picture was from Dr. Malter years ago, and really said, the people who are trying to sleep at night, they can't get to sleep because they can't shut their mind off, but they're physically exhausted. And this is kind of one of the number one issues alongside brain fog when we've got too much copper. And so here are some of the main copper symptoms. This was taken, and I apologize, I think once I transferred this over, I don't have the website on here, but it's easy. It's coppertoxic.com. A friend of mine, Rick Fisher, specializes in copper toxicity, has been spending decades of his life researching about copper toxicity. Visit his website. This is taken from his website. Again, some of the main issues are fatigue, exhaustion. I had chronic fatigue when I had copper. I had estrogen dominance I couldn't get rid of when I had copper. But depression, panic attacks, there's so many symptoms of copper toxicity, and a lot of times they can get to be very severe depending on how long the exposure has been there, how depleted the adrenals are, and what steps are being taken to change it. So now let's dig into copper and iron and talk a little bit deeper about that relationship. So again, as I mentioned, copper toxicity is often misdiagnosed as iron deficiency anemia. And HTMA should be assessed prior to supplementing with iron due to the fact that if bioavailable copper is not present and ceruloplasmin levels are low, then you actually may have iron toxicity rather than deficiency. You've got enough iron in the body, it's just not able to be utilized. And so when we look at, this is a great article too, I wanted to include this one. It's called The Metabolic Crossroads of Iron and Copper. And so ultimately at the end of the day, what this means is that we have iron and copper, they're linked through ceruloplasmin, right? That copper containing enzyme it's the taxi cab to transport copper around the body. And it catalyzes the oxidation of ferrous iron to ferric ion, and then that binds to your apotransferrin, right? And so when this process happens, this is how iron is utilized. So without that copper containing enzyme, without enough ceruloplasmin, copper can't be mobilized and iron ends up being stuck. So this is a really important thing to understand because, again, a lot of times, and I will tell you, you see this time and time again, when someone has copper issues on an HTMA test, they will have low ferritin and other iron markers potentially on their blood labs. It's really important never to supplement iron from just an HTMA. You have to have blood labs, full iron blood labs, to be able to analyze that appropriately. And so when we have that to reflect on, it really kind of gives us a background of how this is connected. But also, once we fix the copper problem, iron tends to come back. And the other interesting part is if you do have someone, a client who has copper dysregulation, I find a lot of them are already supplementing with iron. They've been given iron by their GP or their ND, and it's not doing anything to their levels in blood, right? It's not changing. They've taken it for 5 or 6 years and nothing's happening, right? And so when you read the last line of this is really important. Copper deficient rodents, this is what this article was based on, also accumulate iron in hepatocytes, most likely because of reduced CP activity. But remember that copper deficiency and toxicity are interchangeable because if we have too much copper in the body, it also decreases ceruloplasmin because of the adrenal effect. right? So this really, you have to look at both sides of this to really understand the full effect. And so let's talk about the ratios involved in iron evaluation, specifically on the HTMA test. So we have 4 ratios to analyze to be able to look at iron deficiency. So analyzing iron to copper, iron to lead, iron to mercury, and calcium to iron can give us some really big insights. And so when we're looking at the ideal ratio for each of these, what I want to bring to the table is we want to have, so let's start with the bottom. So if you see present a lower than ideal ratio for your iron to copper, which should be 0.9, so if it's less than that. If you see lower than ideal iron to lead, which should be equal to or greater than 5.6, so less than 5.6, and iron to mercury, lower than the ideal, which is equal or greater than 28, so less than 28, and an elevated calcium to iron, which the ideal is 15. These together may indicate iron deficiency strictly from HTMA marks. Now, I tell you again, I still recommend doing a full iron blood panel to make sure that you're correlating the whole picture, right? HTMA and blood really go hand in hand to give you the long-term data and the snapshot to really provide the best analysis. So let's look at an example. So this is an example of kind of not a typical SLOX actually, but this person has copper issues. You can see the copper's at 2.9, the ideal is 2.0, right? So we have copper toxicity here. And the iron is low, it's at 0.5, but it doesn't always look like this, like with these markers. So when we look at calcium to iron, right? We look at 50 divided by 0.5, that's going to be greater than 15. So yes, that is greater than 15. The iron to lead, you can actually see that where the arrows are indicating. So the iron to lead in this particular case is 5.0. Is it less than 5.6? It is. Iron to copper less than 0.9? It is as well. It's 0.17. You can see that on the right-hand side of the significant ratios chart. And is the iron to copper or iron to mercury, less than 28? Yes, it's at 16.7. So we can say that this particular individual who shows overt copper toxicity, and for those of you who are familiar with the test, that elevated cobalt goes hand in hand with copper because of liver congestion. Now we have an iron problem as well. So some causes for iron deficiency outside of, kind of other things that we can, copper, for example, there are other reasons that iron can be deficient. So diets low in meat and eggs, vegetarian diets, heavy menstrual periods can be another one, increased physiological requirements, excess blood loss, infections or parasites can be another one, right? Because they're using that iron to live, right? They're consuming it. Hence why when we have parasites or even potential infections on board, it can be dangerous to supplement with iron because now we're feeding the pathogen. Over-the-counter and prescription painkillers, and I've got a special note here. So sometimes when you have someone who could potentially be ingesting painkillers like Tylenol or Aleve is another one, Excedrin, right? You got the list there. They could actually suffer from stomach and intestinal irritation that can actually result in hidden bleeding into the intestines. And it often isn't discovered until the person is severely anemic. So if you've got somebody who's using these types of, pain or inflammation reduction constantly, you may have a secondary problem that they might be contributing to as well. So just keep that in mind. And so, as we know, iron deficiency, that can lead to fatigue, weakness, shortness of breath. Chronic candida can be another one, impaired thyroid function, and pale complexion, right? That's a common one too. And these symptoms may be due to copper imbalances, potentially vitamin A deficiency, which, kind of keeps copper kind of bioavailable, right? But there can be other contributing factors, as I mentioned as well. So again, as I talked about earlier, supplementing with iron is not necessarily not common practice, but it just needs to be looked at very strategically. And usually it's after a series of HTMA tests and blood analysis, right, to see what we're dealing with. If we've identified copper, sometimes we need that acute support with iron if it's really low. And a lot of times I use patches instead of oral supplementation because it's not necessarily as well absorbed. I've had much better results with the patches. Iron can also help to raise a low sodium level. So again, this is a secondary strategy. Looking at, again, your HTMA, your blood analysis, and making that educated decision is going to be really important, and patches are always a great option. So to kind of give you a little summary, because I did mention blood, I'm not going to dive into it because that's not why we're here, but I thought I would give you this chart just as a takeaway. And so when we look at iron on blood labs, there's a number of markers that you can assess to identify iron deficiency. And then, of course, in the center, you'll see these are the ones that we already looked at with regards to the markers that you can utilize on HTMA. So there's lots of different marks that you can use with regards to kind of summarizing iron deficiency, and then approaches that you can take to support that as well, depending on, again, what exactly you're dealing with, which you'll identify. So let's dig into just some basic strategies and share some of the strategies with regards to slow and fast oxidation, and even some synergists with iron. So as you all know, I think you already know most of these things, but I always like to bring them back into the picture because sometimes we overlook things or get tied up at other things. And so again, dialing into nutrition, that's the number one. Basing that on the oxidation rate is even better. Right? And remember as well, when we see someone in 4 lows, right, that pattern where calcium, magnesium, sodium, potassium are below their optimal levels, those people tend to be treated as slower oxidizers because they're lacking the minerals that they need. Focus on nutrient-dense foods, right? We don't want to be eating foods that are, have a high volume but no nutrients. Daily movement practice, but be careful of the intense exercise, especially with those that are in slow oxidation, especially slow 1 subtype, because that can be more detrimental to them. They need more of the gentle movement like walking, yoga, and things like that. Practicing deep breathing is another great option for those in slow oxidation to allow the body to heal. Sleep is going to be critical in all stages. And if you have somebody who has copper on board, is a slow oxidizer, potentially even in 4 lows, they may even, again, have that chronic fatigue that they're struggling with and may need to have a nap, every weekend or what have you. Many people have that 3 p.m. lull because of the adrenals and the depleted function there as well. So just really focusing on supporting the adrenals is going to be really important. Reducing stress, right? This is another one. And implementing some healthy techniques, whether that's journaling or getting out in the sun or, again, going for a walk, some of those things that produce that stress reducing effect on the body, because really that gear up of stress is what keeps the hamster wheel going, right? And then focus on targeted supplementation. That's important too. So let's talk about diet first. So fast oxidizers, remember their bodies are in that fight or flight, and they're usually showing overactivity. And I'm talking from a basic perspective. So think of that end of that teeter-totter. And so when I think about a fast oxidizer, what I think about is a big blazing fire on the beach. If you've got a big blazing fire, what do you put on it? You don't throw, small twigs on it because they're just going to burn up and it's going to keep going, right? You're going to throw the big logs on it to calm it down and give it some stamina, right? Keep that fire around for a while, because if it keeps burning like this, it's going to go out, right? That's why fast oxidizers, especially if there's overactivity kind of to an extreme, they're fast out of the gate, but they've got no stamina, right? They can't keep going. And so those big logs on that fire equate to more fat, to fattier cuts of meat, to more organ meats, right? Less carbohydrates and simple sugar and fruits and things like that, because those are the twigs, right? Those are the fire starters. So you need to lower those and increase the other kind of heavier, satiating, and again, those bigger logs on the fire. High calcium and high magnesium foods are going to be really important for these particular individuals as well, okay? Now, Take that and completely flip it on its head, and now we've got slow oxidation. And so the diet here needs to be full of twigs and the kindling to light the fire, because that fire on the beach isn't blazing, it's a small little dwindle, and we need to stoke it, right? So by stoking the fire, we need more complex carbohydrates, right? We do need to be cognizant, of course, of blood sugar. We want to have lots of good, clean protein. But in this particular case, they don't necessarily do well with heavy proteins that are higher in fat. So focusing in on those lean proteins, again, using some healthy fats every day, but maybe a little less than the fast oxidizers. And then focusing in on those high potassium, high sodium foods to fire up the thyroid and the adrenals, and avoiding the high calcium foods if they got high calcium on the test, especially, because that's just going to add to the pileup. So some base nutrients that I love, kelp is always great, right? We definitely need more iodine these days. As well, a binder is really great. So a lot of people don't know what binders are. Binders are ingested in the body and bind to toxins, right? Could be environmental toxins, it could be pathogens, it could be heavy metals, right? Zeolite is a great option. It's not the only one I use. I just put it as an example here. But zeolite is wonderful, especially with copper. So it really does have a great effect on the body if there is copper toxicity. So that's why I put that as an example. Intestinal support is another one. You may choose to bring in probiotics, even fermented foods. Humic and fulvic acid also, and the right dose has an amazing positive effect on the microbiome. Liver support is another one. Milk thistle, dandelion root. You can even think about dandelion leaves for kidney support. Magnesium, right? We know that both fast and slow oxidizers need magnesium, because what happens? Magnesium burn rate goes up during stressful periods. So who doesn't need magnesium, right? It's just a matter of supporting the body, and especially if someone's constipated, that can come back around to magnesium and potassium deficiency. Unrefined sea salt also is a great option. Again, if there's a really fast oxidizer with really high sodium, you might not want to use too much, but a sprinkle on food and a pinch in water to help activate those sodium potassium pumps is definitely worthwhile. And talking about the specific nutrients, so fast oxidizers really benefit from, again, those calming, kind of more sedative minerals that are going to be anti-stress. So calcium, magnesium, zinc, vitamins B2, right, inositol, choline. And then for both slow and fast, vitamin K2. Why? Because it helps to shuttle calcium into the bones and the teeth. Boron. Why? Because it helps proper calcium retention as well as magnesium absorption, and helps with so many other things. If you haven't read the article, Nothing Boring About Boron, write that down and make sure you take a read. For slow oxidizers, again, we're looking at the more energizing supports. The sea salt to fire up the adrenals, the potassium to help the thyroid expression, magnesium, some selenium. Vitamins A, C, and E, right? Again, great for the adrenals, great to bring copper back into bioavailability. And then our more energizing B vitamins, 1, 3, and 6. So just more energy that we're trying to bring to the table for the slow oxidizers. And I talked about iron synergists, so I'm going to kind of leave it here. So copper assists in energy production and hemosynthesis, and of course can be mobilized and made bioavailable with the right amount of vitamin A. Molybdenum is another iron synergist. Selenium, cobalt in the form of vitamin B12 aids in hemosynthesis. Vitamin C actually increases iron absorption, and B complex vitamins assist in energy production as well. So some great synergists if we've got kind of copper on board and iron deficiency. Okay, and now we are going to open for questions. So let me end my slideshow and stop share so that I can let Jason take back control here.
There we go. That was excellent. Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you.
Yeah, let's dive into some questions. So for those of you on the call, if you want to use that Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. First question that came in, pregnancy anemia is quite common. How would you evaluate mineral ratios?
Yeah, so pregnancy anemia is quite common. So look at your copper markers, right? There's a lot of times that there's a lot of copper markers with women who are pregnant. Again, look at the blood labs for iron, right? There may need to be supplementation. Many doctors like to do that as well. So really, during that period of time, it's critical just to make sure you're bringing in the synergists that are going to help that copper be bioavailable if that's the underlying cause. And you may have to do some iron supplementation at the same time just to make sure that they have enough support, again, depending on blood lab levels.
Okay. Any thoughts on a metabolic blockage towards copper uptake being caused by a trauma event?
Whew, that's a big loaded question.
I know.
Yeah, when you think about trauma, the minerals that are affected by trauma, the first one's going to be sodium, but at the end of the day, it's going to be calcium. So I don't necessarily, you have to think about things backwards sometimes, so bear with me as I talk through this in my head. So a lot of times we think cart, horse, horse, cart, right? So it's like if you have an exposure to copper, we know that the stress response is going to happen, magnesium is going to deplete, calcium is allowed to rise, right? And that's going to cause its own set of problems. But you can also go the other way around, right? So if you have a traumatic experience, that is going to it's going to cause the same stress response. So let's say you lose a loved one. Sodium is going to increase. Kidneys are going to retain sodium at the expense of potassium. So we know that happens. So it's going to make a really high sodium to potassium ratio, acute alarm stage of stress. That's going to burn magnesium. It's just what happens. As soon as magnesium lets the gates open, we know what happens with calcium. But remember that the longer somebody stays in that pattern, the better chance that the sodium is going to drop, right? It goes opposite. Now we have sodium and potassium that are low. So then the body is what we call a poor eliminator. Copper can build at that point because what happens when the body slides into that exhaustive stage, right? That inverted sodium to potassium ratio, the adrenals are going to crash. Well, if the adrenals have crashed, what's going to happen to ceruloplasmin? So if you've got copper hanging around and there's no taxis picking them up from where they are, could you have blocked uptake? Maybe you just don't have any movement. Right? So that could be definitely, kind of a side effect end result of trauma for sure. With regards to depleted uptake, again, I've worked with clients with aceruloplasmia. So that just means they have a genetic SNP where their body physically can't produce enough ceruloplasmin. That's a bit of a tricky situation. So, there's other things that can be, detrimental to, again, that copper transport as well. Hopefully that answered the question.
Yeah, I'm impressed by that. Because that was a different kind of question. So very, very cool how you work backwards. Yeah. Can you remind us again when you use camu versus ascorbic acid vitamin C for copper?
Yeah, for me, really at the end of the day, what it comes down to is what you're trying to do. So I get this question all the time. And so camu doesn't negate ascorbic acid. It has ascorbic acid because that's the outer protective layer of camu. Like that's what protects the C complex is ascorbic acid, right? It's all the other things that are inside that ascorbic acid doesn't have because it's isolated. It's kind of the same, and I'm going to give you a comparison so it's very easy to understand from a visual perspective. It's like using kelp versus iodine, right? I use Lugol's iodine all the time. I've been using it in myself for over 15 years. And if you want to make real change and you need high dose iodine, you're probably not going to do it with kelp because you need so much of it to get very little from this that's the same amount, right? 2 drops of, Lugol's iodine is going to get 5 milligrams of iodine, whereas kelp, you're going to have to consume a whole lot of kelp to get 5 milligrams of iodine. And you're going to get all the other things in the kelp, including toxins, right? It will be physically impossible for us to have a food that comes from the ocean or even from a tree or what have you that doesn't have some toxins in it, right? There's an acceptable level. And so when you really want to get down to the nitty gritty and make change, using the single ingredient sometimes can make more change faster. So to give you an example, even with camu, the one that we use, which is a 10-to-1 extract, you're going to get about 682 milligrams of ascorbic acid in that camu, which works out to be about 5 grams of powder, okay? The ascorbic acid complex is going to get you double that. right? So it's just bringing more to the table. So when someone has copper, especially if it's overt, or something like that, I do tend to use ascorbic acid just because I know what I want to do with it. Once they've mobilized that copper out, or if they're a very sensitive individual and I think that level of ascorbic acid is going to be too high, then I go down the road of camu-camu. At the end of the day, using the more natural source is great. It's just if we really want to create change, you might want to go down the route of the isolated nutrients to do that, and then kind of bring them back around to the more natural formulations.
Cool. Is hemochromatosis going to show up as high iron on HTMA or mostly just seen in bloods?
No, not always. Sometimes. And we had a long chat about iron overload could be contributed to hemochromatosis, of course. The fact that manganese and iron share the same uptake pathway, and the potential of manganese supplementation actually helping to reduce hemochromatosis. Haven't gone far enough down that rabbit hole with testing yet, but we definitely have seen clients with hemochromatosis, very high levels of iron on their panels, be able to bring that down with manganese supplementation, even at 20 milligrams. So there's a few things that you can do. Again, potential of donating blood might be a great idea, but you always want to always base iron on the blood panels, and then bring HTMA back into the picture, just again to complete that circle. Just because I think for that and thyroid, hands down, blood panel and HTMA have to go hand in hand.
Does the constant dopamine production due to instant gratification, which will increase estrogen, as they share the detox pathways, will it increase copper?
Could. Yeah, I don't think we've done enough studies or anything on that to actually prove it, especially based on HTMA. But given the reactions of each, that wouldn't surprise me.
I'm seeing lots of iron off the charts high on client HTMAs, but most of the info talks about anemia. Thoughts on super high iron levels?
What's super high? Give me a number, like 15 or 2, or like what's high? Do you know?
All right, Meg, you heard it. Meg, if you want to put in a number and...
even just an average.
Yeah.
I just need to know what super high means, and then I definitely can help chat.
Well, let's go to another question while Meg is putting that in.
Okay.
When you said to look at calcium iron, are you just dividing calcium HTMA score by iron HTMA score?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Meg says 15 to 25, super high.
15 to 20, that's crazy high. Okay, so in those cases, and sorry, I keep going back with questions, Meg, but in any of those cases, can you correlate that with aluminum showing up on the heavy metal chart?
Yes, some aluminum generally showing.
Okay. It still seems really high, but I'll give you a background. So aluminum is deeply tied into iron, manganese, chromium, and more selenium with animals than humans, but still selenium. So those 4 amigos are tied up with aluminum. So if you have aluminum show up high in the test, you're going to have most likely iron react to that aluminum and increase. You could also have one of manganese or chromium. Manganese is more common, right? So a lot of times when you have elevated aluminum, you're going to have elevated iron and manganese. Again, you may see chromium alongside that too. Now, there are exceptions to that rule. With the testing that I did, the first aluminum toxicity testing, because every horse has aluminum toxicity, the ratio of like the increase of iron to aluminum is like 1 to 1.5 to 1. Right? So if you've got like an aluminum at 15, then your iron would be at 15 or 20. If your aluminum's at 1 and your iron's at 15, you have a whole different problem, right? And so you've got to look at sources, right? Water, right? Is there water that's a source? Is there something else that could be contributing to this buildup? Because those levels are really high. So some digging is going to be warranted for that. And, you know, the other thing, we see really high levels of, say, iron, even when you see, we call them water patterns. So it's when a lot of the elements on the nutritional elements chart are high. Sometimes it comes back around to water. A lot of times well water is intertwined with that. Even at that level, like when you think about internal, like pathogens, H. pylori is a big one, right? Infections. What happens is the body wants to shuttle iron out because it's trying to starve the infection that is inside the body, consuming the iron, right? But I'm going to tell you, I don't think I've ever seen an infection where the iron was at 15. Like usually they're around 2.9 or like 3.5 or something like that. I've never seen them that high. Yeah. I hope that
How does
helps.
one use iron patches?
How does one, sorry?
Use iron patches.
Oh, iron patches, yeah. So Patch Aid is a good, Patch Aid. Yeah, Patch MD is the one that has Iron Plus. So there's a few other things in it. Patch Aid just has a patch called Simply Iron, and you just stick a patch on like every day. Every 24 hours, put on a new patch. And I usually try, like, I've used them with kids too. We cut them in half. You know, again, when ferritin's really low, like sometimes you have ferritin come in, it's at like 10, it's like, okay, even though we have copper, we still have to bring something into the picture because it's just too low, right? So sometimes you have to go down that road. So I'll do it for like 30 days and then kind of retest and see how things go. It's interesting too, because the patches, I mean, I've been using those for maybe 7 or 8 years. And I was very skeptical about them in the beginning because I thought, oh my gosh, like the iron that's on the patch itself, it's really not that high, but I found that it works really well with regards to the result on blood labs after you use them.
Cool. We'll do a couple more questions, and then maybe you can share a little bit about the HTMA course, and then I can do a giveaway to kind of close out the evening.
Excellent.
Okay, so some of the symptoms of copper toxicity are also part of Parkinson's symptomatology. Do you see a copper link with this disease?
No, usually it's manganese and aluminum with Parkinson's. Manganese is a big one. So if you've got, I mean, Parkinson's is heavily tied into toxic metals, especially aluminum. I'm not saying it can't come from that, but if you think about manganese, one of the issues, especially with manganese mines, so when you think about metals or minerals that become toxic, manganese is one of them. Selenium can be another one. A lot of times when they're inhaled, it's actually more detrimental to the body. And so when you pick up cases, like we had a case in Connecticut, we had a case in Alaska, they lived near an old manganese mine and their manganese was off the charts and it was giving them symptoms of Parkinson's. Right? It's called manganese madness. And everything kind of mimics Parkinson's. So manganese definitely has been researched and kind of heavily tied up in that. Copper, not so much. So I can't necessarily say exactly. But again, I feel like there's so much more to unravel in the next decades with minerals and things like that and what they're tied into. I think that anything is possible.
If patients would prefer to continue with their HRT or contraceptive, do you still treat their copper toxicity and or iron deficiency?
Yes. So really what you have to think about with copper and continuing with HRT, things like that, is you have to support the adrenals. You've got to bring zinc into the picture. And ideally, depending on what the copper level, like what that looks like and how low their adrenal function is, you probably want to bring in some molybdenum because that really does help to metabolize estrogen in the liver. So a little microdose of molybdenum can go a long way as well. It doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be able to fix the problem, unfortunately, but it can help the problem, right? So it can help support the adrenals and help the body to be able to kind of step up and be more optimal even while still kind of taking those things. And I'll tell you with HRT, for example, I'm 51, perimenopause was 3 years ago. And I'll tell you that I've seen better results with supporting the adrenals and using higher doses of boron with mineral balancing. Even symptoms like hot flashes, night sweats, things like that start happening to me. And then I was like, I didn't really put two and two together. I'm like, oh, I'm just busy. And then I'm like, wait a minute, I'm not sleeping. This is not right. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I know what's happening, right? And so then after I changed it, about a month later, the symptoms left and away they went. I've never had them back. So I think there's a lot you can do with mineral balancing when you kind of hit that period, if that's when HRT is coming into the picture. Again, during that beginning phase of perimenopause too, your copper's kind of going like this. And I didn't realize it until I went through it, because even mine, not using anything other than mineral balancing and, peptides and things like that, my copper shot up to 3, and then it went down to 1.5, and then it shot up to 2.8. And so my copper was fluctuating the whole time. So could you imagine if I was on estrogen, when that copper shot up naturally, I would have been even higher, right? So I think about that too, in that relationship, because again, there's a lot you can do with regards to that period of time in boron, if that's the HRT time period that we're talking about.
Okay. Awesome. You want to share a little bit about the HTMA course? Yeah. So the HTMA course is a level 1 practitioner course, really tells you about the basics, right? Gives you a lot about analysis, conditions that are related to HTMA. It talks about calcium shell. It talks about how to use iodine. We talk about protocols. We talk lots about heavy metals and some of the additional elements, so that you really have a deep understanding about the analytics of the test. And then it helps at the last class kind of put everything together with regards to protocols, kind of similar to the tidbit that I shared with regards to the slow and fast oxidation, but in a lot more detail. So yeah, I'm super excited about it. It's coming out on onboarding September 23rd. So I'm really excited about that. Awesome. And I just shared the link in the chat for everyone. So you can visit the link, learn a little bit more. Obviously there will be the steps for registering, or if you need to reach out to us with any questions, then we can do that. And we also have a giveaway tonight.
Time for the draw. This is the most exciting time.
Yeah. What's our prize?
Yeah, so the prize is an HTMA test with a consultation with one of our practitioners at the Advanced Health Labs.
Cool. I got, so throughout the presentation, I was taking down all the names of everyone that's here tonight. I got them in my trusty Vitamix. And,
I love it.
we're gonna... And our winner is Richard Crawford. So congratulations,
Yay,
Richard.
Congratulations, Richard.
Richard, I'm going to put my email in the chat, and if you just want to copy that and send me an email, and then we can connect about next steps. Okay. And Lisa, I see there's a couple more questions. Do you have a few minutes before you run?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So the follow-up to the iron patches, would you use iron patches and iron oral supplementation at the same time?
No.
No. And how do we lower manganese?
How do we lower manganese? That's a bit of a tough one. I mean, depending on, well, it depends on why it's high, right? If you've got somebody who lives near an old mine and they're inhaling it, it's going to be really hard. You need to get zeolite, a good binder, into the picture. That should help. If you have elevated manganese, because, and this can happen also with iron deficiency, right? Remember I said iron and manganese share the same uptake pathways. It could be iron, which could be copper, right? You've got to kind of talk through the steps on the way down and say, am I at the root cause yet? Yes or no? Maybe not. Okay, let's go to the next level. Am I at the root cause now, right? So there could be other instances where that's, where that's an issue too. And sometimes even supplementation can, I mean, again, this is a very obvious one, but even with supplementation, sometimes if you do a low enough dose, it can come down. Now, I don't necessarily suggest that with manganese because it can become toxic, similar to how selenium can. So just be very careful with some of those minerals that can come to a toxic level.
Awesome. And thank you, Lisa. That was an awesome evening. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for being here. And if this has sparked an interest in HTMA, then visit that link in the chat. As Lisa mentioned, the next onboarding is happening later this month. So Thank you all. I'll see some of you, I'm sure, at the next Con Ed webinar. And Lisa, thanks again.
Thank you so much, Jason. It was lovely to meet you, and I hope everyone enjoyed the presentation. Thanks for being here.